Folks, we are live right now once again for episode 4 of Scream Bloody Podcast. I'm Woody, and once again, I am joined by Adrian. Adrian, how you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you doing, Woody?
Well, man, we're back here to do this once again, and this episode, we're going to be diving into a band, into a group, into something that band I was not very familiar with until a few weeks ago, and I've sort of had a crash course as of late in this group's discography. But folks, don't despair, because Adrian has got to be one of the 5 people in the Western Hemisphere most qualified to probably talk about this subject tonight. In fact, probably might be one of the few most qualified people outside of the group itself to talk.
Oh yeah. I mean, I would love to meet those other four people if there are, but yeah, I've been just a huge fan of Sigh. I'm not the type to rally around like singular groups or fanboy anybody. I objective first, critical, and kind of an asshole with that sort of stuff. But I don't know. Sigh's always been a band that always lived up to what I suppose as a fan would want from them, but also have done so many things that I don't think anyone could really predict. And just the longer I listen to metal and dig deep and familiarize myself, they just always kind of stay at the top of the heap for me. And there's not really anything else like listening to a Psy album for me.
Well, folks, yep, we are going to be going in depth talking about Japanese black metal slash avant garde band Psy. Now, there, I guess we got kind of a sort of a double pronged thing to discuss here. On the one hand, we're talking about a black metal band, and with black metal, you can usually ask about 10 different people about what it is, and you'll get 15 different opinions back. And then we're also talking about heavy metal being very Eurocentric in the past and also very rooted in North America. We're going to a band from Asia, which not as prominent as some other bands you could say, but I think there is a long-standing tradition from there. And in the last 20 years, those markets have really opened up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are roots in 80s Japanese heavy metal, but I don't really think there's much of a connection between that sort of thing and Psy
Mm-hmm.
because we don't have, I mean, as far as like the Japanese groups go, I mean, there was like X or Loudness or there's a band I really like called Anthem that was fairly obscure. But I mean, that stuff was more, catchy, maybe arena style heavy metal. Definitely had its own quirks and Japanese flavor, but I don't really see much of a link between bands like that and Psy. You didn't really have like first wave black metal. Maybe you could say Sabbath. I do know I've been lucky enough to interview Mirai, and I was kind of curious if he was aware of them, and I know they weren't that much of an influence on Psy. Beyond that, I don't see too much of a bridge between maybe the sort of more, I don't want to say the word mainstream because I love X and Loudness in those bands too, but relatively speaking compared to underground black metal, like I don't really see the link. I don't see the Celtic Frost or Venom of Japan as much. So definitely the extreme metal scene in Japan kind of, I think, just sprung up probably from tape trading and just mutual appreciation of those kinds of bands. And Psy kind of approached things at first in the same roots with the Norwegian bands, which was they weren't really into necessarily like where the death metal scene was heading, like when those bands started getting on major labels and maybe having glossier productions and stuff like that. And they kind of wanted to harken back to the more evil thrash bands and probably shared most of the same influences.
Would you say Psy was the first extreme heavy metal band to come out of Japan, or certainly one of the first?
Yeah,
Definitely, maybe the most influential.
I think that's probably fair. I definitely, like I said, don't want to take anything away from Sabat because I'm a
Okay.
huge fan of them as
Okay.
well. They definitely started earlier and kind of, they definitely have some blackened elements, but I would say they're a thrash band more than anything else, and amazing band. But I think as far as, I'm not even really sure. I can think of, if I think, I can think of like maybe two like out and out death metal bands that would have existed in the early 90s in Japan. I think it's like Necrophile and Transgressor, which are pretty obscure choices, but I think they should be able to have that title. Them and Abigail are, interestingly enough, are started about the same time in the same town. Literally,
Okay.
the first show either band ever did was with each other. And they've shared members and done side projects together. So as far as age goes, I mean, those are
Okay.
basically the same handful of people between those two bands at the same time. But I think that's just kind of that phenomenon that happened globally, where it's just sort of like, at one point in the early 90s, late 80s, everyone who had an interest in that, started kind of maybe one upping each other or pursuing something that could be
Right.
called, black metal in one way or another.
What part of Japan are they specifically from exactly?
I need to double check that. Metal Archives is saying they're located in Tokyo, but I'm almost certain they didn't start out that.
Hmm.
I might have to look into that. I do know location was part of it. Like in the interview I did with Mirai Kawashima, who's the
Hmm.
if you're not familiar
Yeah.
with Sigh, is the main songwriter, plays
Hmm.
most of the instruments,
Hmm.
in the band, and
Yeah.
kind of the leader, I would say, easily. I know he said, Sabbath was from a different part of Japan, so they didn't really, gig together early
Hmm.
on. I'll look into that because I'm not sure if they've been a Tokyo band. I know they weren't really part of any scene locally, and even still, their gigs are pretty limited. They're not really playing a ton of shows in Japan. Really, not that many shows at all. But they've never been a band that's, I don't think, necessarily been huge in Japan. I know definitely they've been hugely overshadowed by J rock and stuff like that, which I know they've always kind of felt like is the antithesis to what they do.
Hmm.
Something more underground, more old school. As
Right.
weird and avant-garde and experimental as they've gotten, they've still, I think, always had that ethos and core set of values as far as what drives their sound and defines it.
Listening to their music, I have to say, a lot of my expectations were really subverted. The avant-garde element is quite prominent in their music, and I respect it too. There's a quality of their songwriting that I think is able to resonate with me, and I feel like they do go into left field, but it's not like so indecipherably so. Like there's not so out there like I can't even understand what I'm listening to. It's
Yeah,
unconventional, certainly, but in a very interesting way. And that I want, okay, where's this going to keep going? And there's always the extreme meta element that's always prominent there too, as well. So whenever, and also in some ways, even in some traditional heavy metal elements there, in a way too. Like it never becomes too, never too much navel gazing, I guess, in a way, never too pretentious.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important thing. I mean, I'm a huge fan of I guess what would get called avant-garde metal because it doesn't really fit anywhere else. But there's plenty of bands that sort of fall under that label that don't appeal to me. And a lot of that comes down to, I mean, at the end of the day, songwriting is the most important thing. And if you're going to include elements that are unconventional or, that might initially greet the listener with maybe confusion, even, or just surprise, you need to know what you're doing with those elements. And I think, when I was first listening to Psy, when I was much younger, it was kind of just like, oh, the shock of, using sitar, dub elements or saxophone or anything like that. That could all be in the same song, even for, certain Psy albums, was very interesting, and the unpredictability of it. And it was just so crazy. But the older I get, the more I notice that it's not a case of, throwing everything but the kitchen sink or just trying to be weird or gimmicky. It's more a case that the band is incorporating whatever influences are interesting to Mirai or the other members. I think what made it make a lot of sense to me was reading an interview where he, almost reading the tone of it is almost rolling his eyes at the term avant garde. To him, none of this is all that weird. Like, I obviously know I'm sure he has a presence of mind to understand a, heavy metal fan might think it's weird that, their latest album, for instance, prominently features a lot of flute. But I know for an example, they would say something like, the Beatles are a huge influence on us. You could go back decades and decades and find a rock band that uses Eastern elements or you can listen to prog rock and listen to Jethro Tull and say, well, they had plenty of flute. And obviously, it's in a different context with an extreme metal band. But I think from his perspective is that as long as they are a heavy metal band, them incorporating these other elements, it makes sense as long as it's well written and these influences appeal to him. So it's never a case of just adding things to add things. It's not blind experimentation. It's, well, there might be like Mirai's incorporating throat singing because he's influenced by it genuinely and finds a way for it to make sense.
You've spoken to him. Where does his whole like songwriting ethos come from? Would you say?
Well, I think it's a couple elements. I mean, obviously, I mean, Venom is easily the biggest influence. I mean, judging by, I think they've done it over a dozen Venom covers at this point, recorded or played live. That might be even a really low number, and I think that kind of maintains the core of straightforward riff based evil heavy metal. But I think what kind of opens it up, Mirai, as a boy, I know was classically trained as far as piano goes and had a deep appreciation for all kinds of classical music, which I think that you see a lot with Scorn Defeat already. The way they used keyboards was definitely different than anyone else, and at that point, hardly anyone was using keyboards. I think probably you have Emperor, Satyricon, and Enslaved from the Norwegian bands, but for them it was more a lot of times more an atmospheric accent at that point. With Emperor, it definitely got more involved as time went on, but even by the time Sigh were doing their first recordings, his approach to keyboard was as someone who had been classically trained. And I know early on he was mostly writing things on keyboard and then translating it to guitar, bass, and drums. I think the other element that sort of changes their approach, or whichever way you want to look at it, maybe the reason that this exists is because of that sort of seed of looking for different influences in the first place. Is that I don't know if it is anymore, but I know at one point Mirai, part of his just day-to-day life was composing music for commercials. And generally it was just an assignment. They would give you a commercial, and this is the kind of music you need to make. And if it was something he didn't know how to do, he'd figure it out. And I think that kind of speaks to his ability to pick up different elements as they go. I mentioned their last album has a lot of flute. I remember him just posting things on Facebook that about how he just learned flute to put it on the new album, basically. And they took a little more time, because he wanted to get it down, and was kind of asking advice and talking shop with people just on Facebook, and which I think is pretty incredible. Like that he sort of just picked up that instrument and then featured it really prominently and very interestingly on an album.
Well, it's very interesting. He seems to be quite the Renaissance man when it comes to his craft.
Absolutely. I think probably the most interesting thing though is just I mean, and this kind of exploded on Imaginary Sonicscape, was their usage of analog synthesizers, which they've always kind of when you go chronologically, definitely were upping their game as far as what they were using on keyboards. Scorn Defeat, the first album, it's pretty straightforward. Even by the second album, at the time, that was a pretty advanced modern synthesizer in the way they layered it. And then as time has gone on, they're more apt to use vintage analog synthesizers, which I think makes it really age really, really well. I mean, there's something we said about the charm of like a cheap keyboard on a 90s black metal album, but there's a lot of depth on some of that stuff they do, and just layers and layers. And as much as I listen to the band, if I'm in a different setting, I might notice something I've never even heard before on some of those albums.
Their first recordings were the Desolation demo that came out. I have just sometime in 1990, no specific date there. How long was the band together before they made that first demo?
I mean, I think it was a matter of months, probably. I imagine that was, one of their early rehearsals. I don't believe that was recorded in a studio, but yeah, I think that was more or less a plug in, put a recorder in the middle of the room kind of thing. But no, that the band had not been together for very long at all. Probably what's interesting about that recording is it featured their original drummer, who's just credited as Kazuki, who's not on anything else. Their I've always found it very interesting that the band, I mean, I could count on one hand more or less how many lineup changes they've had. They've mostly just added members as they've gone on, but that was one of the few like lineup changes they ever had. He gets credit for drawing their logo, and then I don't think he did anything else. But
There was also Barai, how you pronounce it? Kawashima?
I've heard Kawashima or Kawashima. My
Kawashima.
my Japanese pronunciation, I'm not sure, but definitely one or the other.
And at the time, he was their guitar player, Satoshi Fujinami.
Yep, and Satoshi is has been there since the beginning and
Okay.
has more or less, as the releases go on, just gone to whatever instrument they need.
Hmm.
He's been their bassist now for a while. He was their drummer for a while before that. He's been the guitarist, just kind of whatever the band needed at the time he played.
After the Desolation demo, there was then the Requiem for Fools EP put out in 1992. Do you have anything to say about that, Adrian?
Oh well, there was a Tragedies demo came out the same year as
Okay.
Desolation.
Okay.
Which was I'd say a slight step up. I mean, the first demo is definitely kind of murky, almost death doom metal in some
Hmm.
ways. But I think Tragedies they kind of started to step up a little bit. I know Wild Rags put out Tragedies in some form, so that would be their first instance of a label. And then that was kind of what led to Requiem for Fools, which was their first release on any kind of vinyl, which Wild Rags put out on both 7-inch and cassette. I would say that Tragedies was decent, but Requiem for Fools is where it gets really interesting. I believe that was the recording that got Euronymous' attention
Hmm.
and led them to their deal with Death Like Silence. Though supposedly how it goes is, they were in touch with Dead from Mayhem, and after his suicide, Euronymous, I guess, picked up his correspondence and sort of realized that he was talking to, this band from Japan. And I know Euronymous was said to have been very interested in bands from other countries. I mean, Mayhem was, I always thought maybe more influenced by Sarcophago than anyone else. I know he was very into Brazilian metal. Death Like Silence is a Sodom
Hmm.
song, right? So it seems like that was in line. Like he was probably very interested to hear this band from Japan. But Requiem for Fools is a much darker recording than the other two. I would say the demos are fine. Most of those songs have been re-recorded in better ways, and Requiem for Fools is kind of where they did that. They took some of that material, recorded some darker stuff, brought some new material, and sort of I would say that's an important recording as far as their early days go.
Yeah, something that you brought up here that I wanted to mention that the first album did come out on Def Like Science Productions. I am just wondering what that connection was between Mirai and Euronymous over there in the European scene.
Yeah, they were. I'm not sure initially how that contact first came about. Like I said, I know it was first through Dead. I imagine just tape trading and that was common back then with more prominent figures of the underground. But it was something that they were very interested in, and I know that they said as they were sort of going back and forth with the Norwegians, they always kind of were never sure how much of what they were saying was actually true. They didn't hearing about suicide and murder and police investigations and all that just through letters, because it's not like you could just look it up on the internet and verify anything. But yeah, Scorn Defeat has the honor of being one of the very few albums that actually came out on Death Like Silence. Don't think it came I think it came out after Euronymous' death. I know the band were initially upset with the way the album had been released, because the cover art was actually just a sketch
Hmm.
Murai did, that was supposed to
Okay.
be redone by an artist. But I don't know if it was just, I think it was probably just, budget issues. They were definitely weren't making any money. And I think maybe Euronymous died a little before the album actually came out. Definitely, if all Sigh ever did was Scorn Defeat, they would be an important, cult act that was very influential, I'd say, with Eastern black metal. I can't think of anyone else who was doing, anything on an album scale like this. And, I actually said 94, but looking at the release date, it was very tail end of 93 this came
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, December '93.
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of considered 1994 to be sort of golden age of Norwegian black metal, because I think that was Nightside Eclipse and maybe was that Shadow Throne and then De Mysterious, and Berserman Enslaved had some great releases that year too. That's kind of peak black metal, I would say, at that point. And already you have a band thousands of miles away doing something vastly different than anybody else, sort of rebelling against a sound that hasn't even really totally been established yet.
Mhm.
Of course, that wasn't their intent necessarily. They were just grew up in a different environment and had different influences, different musical training. But that was probably what attracted me to the band initially, was that sort of Eastern occultism, just seeing the album covers. And
Yeah.
you can look at that and I'm just like, well, that's, you have hellfire and demons and all that stuff, but a very different style than what you would generally expect.
Listening to Scorn Defeat initially, there is that sort of standard rawness that you would come to expect, generally from black metal. But at the same time, a juxtaposition is a word I'll probably use a lot to describe the sort of the stylings of Sigh's music. There's just they'll be interspersed, and it's interesting that you bring up that he was a classically trained pianist, which that explains a lot now, because throughout their discography, there's a lot of just very beautiful piano work that I'm very enamored with. It works so well with what they come up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, there's plenty of bands that I would say, would get bogged down by that kind of keyboard usage. Like, it might dilute what was going on, but that was never the case with Sigh, never has been. I mean, I think it's two things, is that they, when they incorporate different elements and do a kind of juxtaposition, they don't bend maybe different things, or water them down. It's like, if there's going to be heavy metal guitar, there's going to be riffs. If there's going to be keyboard, it's going to be rooted in some kind of style that makes sense. It's not just, a heavy metal guy just playing around on a keyboard. It's like, he understands that instrument and treats it in a different way than, a guitar. I think everything serves its purpose on that. And I mean, that's the mind blowing thing, is just how much, they kind of push that attitude, where Scorn Defeat is, raw black metal with, a few different kind of elements. There is kind of an experimental approach on Victory of Decani, the first song,
Hmm.
where there's kind of like a weird noise freak out solo. I
Yeah.
think they said they were already at that point listening to a lot of Frank Zappa, stuff like that. But for the most part, it's raw black metal and classically inspired keyboard. Which, if that's something like that came out now, you might think, well, that's not that out there of an approach. But like I said, we're still talking about 1993,
Hmm.
and even with us simplifying it to just calling it, old school black metal, they still, even if you took away all those other elements, their
Right.
their riffing didn't sound like what the Norwegian bands were doing at the time.
We've talked about this before, Adrian, and something that's I've become more aware of is sort of the regional flavor, I think, that can come out in a particular band. Because we in the Norwegian black metal scene had their sort of a visual, their particular sound, and then at the same time there was also their scene in the Mediterranean. The Greeks, they had their set of bands that had their own particular kind of way of writing and had sort of their own specific, like tone color and just how their albums would overall sound. Same subgenre of music, but there was sort of a regional flavor to it. Similarly, also down in Brazil too, they had their own stuff, and so with Psy in Japan, they sort of have, from where they are in the world, sort of have their own specific sound as well.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually just thinking, Greek black metal is interesting to bring up too, because it's, my initial, exposure to black metal, which I'm sure most people's is, was, the sort of classic Norwegian bands and all those bands, the way they were connected. And I know, hearing Rotting Christ or Verathron and Necromantia for the first time, it was definitely almost polar opposite in some ways, within, like, is undoubtedly black metal. When you heard it, it had that dark atmosphere, that attitude, it had like almost a warmth to it. As I've kind of listen to that sort of stuff more, I noticed that it seems like, I mean, if you wanted to oversimplify it, that, you know, a lot of those Greek bands were maybe more influenced by Merciful Fate than Bathory. And then definitely, I mean, Bathory is your sort of quintessential Scandinavian black metal band, you know, really kind of laid out the style while creating it in some ways. But yeah, and that just goes to show the beauty of that, you know, international, different pockets of the world, how they can, you know, come to define themselves. I don't really think there ever was necessarily a Japanese black metal scene at any point. For whatever reason, it was mostly just Sigh and, you know, Abigail. But it is interesting how those bands kind of came up at the exact same time and have you know, endured together. I mean, Abigail probably, you know, is definitely a lot more straightforward. As they've gone, they've kind of, you know, I'd say simplified things out, straightened it out to kind of more just really Venom worship. But they're good at what they do, definitely. And I mean, I think if you heard them, you know, they kind of have a little bit of that style that maybe Sigh started out with, but, you know, obviously without the experimental and classical elements, of course.
Going from Scorn Defeat, they put their debut record out. After that is Infidel Art, released, I have October 1995 on Cacophonous Records, correct?
Yep, yeah, that was the first of several albums for Cacophonous, which are kind of notorious. I find that label very interesting because I can, you know, I have like an old catalog of theirs, and I'm just thinking, you know, this is some of my favorite music they released in the mid '90s, which was the early works of Cradle of Filth and Dimmu Borgir. I think most of Balsagoth's music was on there. They did a lot of, I guess, symphonic black metal and stuff like that. They're also kind of notorious for going bankrupt with, I think, like bands like Cradle of Filth and Dimmu Borgir. They had the resources to kind of sue and get their own material. Not to go on too much of a tangent, but I know Cradle of Filth, part of the reason one of their albums even exists is that it was recorded as kind of a severance with Cacophonous. But this was probably you know, their first real push from a label. As you know, as they sort of joined Death Like Silence, it disintegrated. And really that label's more known for its historical significance than, you know, necessarily what it did for bands at the time. But Infidel Art is definitely reflected by the fact that Mirai had, you know, gotten a new synthesizer and first really had the capabilities to layer. I hesitate to use the word symphonic because I feel like there's a maybe a stereotypical picture that's created when you say symphonic black metal. But I mean, there was definitely orchestration, layering of multiple keyboard instruments to kind of mimic an orchestra. And, you know, with Psy, they were able to pull this sort of thing off. Of course, probably due to the classical training and that kind of ambition. Yeah, Infidel Art's still one of my favorite albums of theirs. They definitely have a lot of really longer songs on here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting ways they introduce different reprises and experiment with that layering, you know, building up songs as they go. There's definitely still elements of you know, the earliest recordings of them. This was, as their discography has gone on at this point, there's been, I think, 3 instances at this point where they've recorded Desolation, and each time it's gotten longer and more varied. So in some ways, to me, this is kind of the ending of them sort of layering and refining their sound from the very beginning. I think at this point they kind of maybe sidestepped a little bit for the next recording. But I would say if you're following along, you know, with the band chronologically at this point, this is kind of like them going a little more over the top, not necessarily changing the influences, but instead of just, you know, a 5-minute song with some piano, you know, you have an 8-minute song with layers and layers of synthesizers.
They seem to have a way of composing their songs that they'll be full on full court press with the black metal sound. Then it'll go right into some piano interlude or some kind of like, you know, orchestral break, if you will, before maybe going on then to a completely another different section entirely, and then maybe coming back around to when they're like doing a full black metal riff or something.
Yeah, and then just doing both at the same time, you
Yeah.
know, here and there. But yeah, I always I think infidel art's not there. I don't think there's any, if you're a new listener, any one place I'd recommend to start, because I think the beauty of that band is something that unfolds the more you kind of explore their catalog. I don't think there's any one song, one album that could possibly define them. I don't think infidel art's a bad place to start, especially if you're, a fan of older cult 90s style kind of releases, which if you are, you should definitely be familiar with most of the releases we've mentioned so far.
In the interim between the next studio record, they put out the Ghastly Funeral EP. I'm reading April 1997. Is there something significant about this EP, Adrian?
I think so. I would say this album, well, I always consider it a mini album, and it
Okay.
kind of it definitely should be referred to as such, because and if you, I guess, were really paying attention, if you didn't already know, all their releases, they spell their name, in a cycle basically,
Yeah.
and Ghastly Funeral Theater is the G. So
Yep.
for them, they've always considered it as an important release as the albums.
Mhm.
I know that this was a conscious effort to lean on the Japanese occultism more so. All the song titles are in Japanese. The original plan was for it to be a split with Abigail and kind of do a full length between the two bands that really explored dark Japanese mythology. That wasn't the case, but it's a standalone piece. It does have a lot of keyboard instrumental work, and a lot of bands, I would say, I mean, looking at the track listing, there's, as many instrumentals as there are songs. Most bands, I would say, as a rule, that's a bad idea. But I really feel like, their keyboard work is just as engaging as anything else. But yeah, this, I would say, this is a very significant EP, in just how, deep they kind of dive into a sort of a local culture to them, but with a very, very dark twist, which, there's more Japanese lyrics on this. Definitely, it's just sort of steeped in that kind of mysticism.
Is their culture, their sort of folklore of Japan, is that has that always been a prominent influence in Psy? Is that just one component of all they do?
I mean, it definitely seems like it. I'd imagine they're like, any other group of teenagers fascinated by that sort of thing, which is, looking up occult literature and demonology
Mm.
and that sort of thing. It's just for them, that was one, it was different than what everyone else was doing. And two, it was what they, I'm sure, in some ways were already familiar with.
Are they really flying the flag of like a Japanese extreme metal here, or are they sort of just an entity unto themselves? The fact that from Japan is sort of irrelevant.
I think so. I don't think necessarily the fact that they're a Japanese band is, I mean, obviously it's colored certain approaches, and that's kind of inescapable, but I don't think it's so much that as the fact that they were just very isolated from, their influences. They weren't growing up going to see the bands that, they were into as local acts, or
Mhm.
really, I'd say, influenced by their peers that much. I think more that isolation is more the defining aspect of it.
From the Ghastly Funeral Theater EP, we go to their next full length, Hail Horror Hail, released December 1997, also on Cacophonous Records. Able to get this one in a little bit. I feel like from the title track, there seems to, for an extreme band, there also just kind of seems to be this underlying, like traditional, almost new wave of British heavy metal influence that seems to be prevalent in their songwriting. They'll be very melodic at sometimes. I've noticed.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, and they're really, I mean, maybe Ghastly Funeral Theater had been recorded for a while, but considering how close that recording and Hail Horror Hail are in time, I really think Hail Horror Hail is a very significant kind of divider, we could say, in their sound. And like you said, with their kind of embracing of maybe more straightforward heavy metal as opposed to just black metal, I think is one of the most significant elements. Yeah, I agree. I definitely hear, I mean, I would even say I hear a lot of Tony Iommi
Hmm.
in some of the guitar leads and some of the riff structures in it. But then at the same time, we have the experimental elements are definitely done in a much different approach. I mean, you still have layered synthesizers and symphonic
Right.
elements, intricate piano, but also a new element that they've still to this day experimented with that they started on Hail Horror Hail is a different approach as far as the music goes in a linear way, which is you have songs that might cut in the middle of a riff, go to something else. You have a lot of experimental post editing. And once again, there's, the band has a reason for this. It's not just to be weird or anything like that, which is that Hail Horror Hail is more or less supposed to be approached like a horror movie in that,
Okay.
a movie might cut in the middle of a scene
Okay.
or go to something drastically different suddenly, for dramatic effect or
Hmm.
to serve the scene. And there's even, which this is one of my favorite things is, I think we said they've always been shy of being pretentious, but for me, they live up to this. There's a disclaimer on the back saying basically, if these things don't make sense, it's on you. It's not because there's something wrong with the music. But I think that was some kind of weird compromise in that I think the label didn't want that sort of thing, that they thought people would think, their CD was fucked up when, it kind of just speeds up and ends a song in the middle of it or something else in a different time signature fades in. To me, it works. I think Hail Horror Hail definitely is something that works better listening front to back than picking out individual songs. You still have riffs though. That's something they never abandoned. So there's definitely an immediate element, but for me, it's listen to that like you'd watch a movie. Put it on from beginning to end.
Regarding, I think, forgot to mention the lineup of the band at the time. Right now, it's still Mirai and Satoshi in the group at this point, and but by the time they put this out, they've been joined by Shinji Ishikawa on guitars, I
Yeah,
believe.
actually, yeah. His he would have joined I think right before they were going into production for Scorn Defeat.
Okay.
And yeah, his presence is of course extremely significant. Like I said, the band never really changed members very much. They kind of just added members as they went. At one point, when they were first kind of garnering the attention of the international scene, it was just Satoshi and Mirai. And then Shinichi kind of joined the band as they were stepping up to that worldwide stage. And at this point, yeah, it's been that three piece just going strong.
Have they toured outside of Japan by this point?
I don't believe so.
Really?
I don't think that really came until maybe the very late 90s, early 2000s. We're at 97 at this point. I do know definitively, as far as America goes, they have only played a handful of shows.
Hmm.
I know they did the Milwaukee Metal Fest, one appearance of that when that still existed. A small tour, probably in the early mid 2000s. Or no, I'm sorry, that would have been like maybe 2007 or 2008. And then their most recent show, unfortunately, I use the word recent because I think it was 2019, was a fest in Atlanta. But even, they've never been a band that's played much. Even they'll do a festival appearance here and there. They've done a couple tours, but they've never been a band that's played a ton of live shows. I think that seemed like it was kind of changing at one point, but there that was, I think, label support. And also they're all people who have day jobs and families at this point. So I don't think there really was a lot of significant touring or live shows. And like I said, they weren't really hugely supported locally. I know that there's a very important story, and I'm not sure the exact timeline of this, but I know they played an early show with Primordial on a European show in Dublin. And I know just because I've seen Alan talk about this, Alan from Primordial talk about this on his podcast, how significant that was, and that they really bonded with Sigh because they felt like outsiders as well. I think
Hmm.
Primordial might have been on Cacophonous at one point,
Hmm.
but they were obviously Ireland's a lot closer to the European scene,
Hmm.
but they still were a sort of small passed over sort of section of the world that wasn't really known. But both of those countries have pretty shining examples of really great bands, Psy and Primordial.
Hmm.
But yeah, I would be, I know that they've played the title track from Hail Horror Hail and Curse of Izanagi on some tours, but even then I know Hail Horror Hail, there's a point where the music kind of just totally transforms into something else in its bridge. And I know they generally just play the first few minutes of that song and kind of cut it off at that point. But yeah, I think this is a point. You mentioned live shows. This is a point where I think a lot of their stuff would become very difficult to play live. They kind of pick and choose what they do. And even to this day, a lot of times they play more of the old stuff that's less complicated arrangements.
Listening to this, I do wonder. I was wondering how this would translate live, if they would be able to just sort of abridge something, or make compromises. Does Mirai do play all these instruments live, or do they do samplings, backing tracks?
Yeah, yes, I would say yes to all that stuff in different ways. It depends what it is. I've been lucky enough to see the band twice. I saw them in Cleveland on the tour I mentioned. I think they did like 2 weeks in support of Hangman's Hymn. And even then, some of those shows got canceled. I think I remember there being like a hurricane in Texas or something. So there were only like 10 shows or something like that back then. But I was lucky enough to see them in Cleveland then. And then I saw their last show in Atlanta at the Mass Destruction Fest. And both times it was, I mean, mostly they would play the older stuff, more straightforward. Generally, Mirai would, play keyboard here and there. The backing tracks I think they only used for that Hangman's Hymn album, which was and I mean we'll get more to this album when we get to it. But I know for that album they didn't use synthesizer as much, and it was more individual performances of brass instruments and backed by keyboard. But that I think they just used the backing tracks for. They also at that point had brought in Mechanable, who was playing saxophone and doing
Right.
vocals, which was interesting because we can go all the way back to I think Ghastly Funeral Theaters when they first used a synthesizer patch of a saxophone, and they were playing I think it was the Knell, which has very very charmingly cheesy fake saxophone on it, but they could play that song with actual saxophone now. But no, they're smart about it. They know what stuff works. They don't really use backing tracks much, but yeah, generally Mirai's performing vocals and keyboard. It's just one guitar, and then they have another vocalist and saxophone player for their live shows. And mentioning Abigail again, the first time I saw Sigh was Yasuyuki, the sort of ringleader of Abigail. He generally plays bass live for them whenever Satoshi isn't able to. But Satoshi did make the Atlanta show. But yeah, I think they understand like when there's 10 different instruments on the recording. I mean, they're not really a band to play to a backing track, so they'll kind of lean towards maybe the more straightforward material to play live.
After Hail Horror Hail, they would put out I Just Have in 1999, their next full length, and their last on Cacophonous would be Scenario 4, Dread Dreams. Is there anything significant about this record in particular out of their whole discography?
It's kind of got a little bit of middle sibling syndrome. I always felt like, so for me, I feel like I kind of champion this album because it gets overlooked. Because Hail Horror Hail I mentioned was very ambitious with committing to that horror movie atmosphere and kind of doing whatever against common practice would dictate to achieve that. And then I don't want to get too much on Imagining Soundscape next, but for a lot of people that's kind of their defining release. So Scenario 4 is kind of in the middle. I would say that Scenario 4 is the first time that maybe the band maybe didn't go further into left field for the compared to the release before it. It's definitely more song oriented than Hail Horror Hail.
Adrian, up to this point, thanks for basically handling the bulk of the work here. The next album that they put out is one I've had a chance to take in, I'd say at least twice so far. And this seems to be, from an outsider's perspective, what I've seen is sort of maybe their quintessential record, or maybe a game changing record for this, for Psy. Imaginary Sonescape. Is that an accurate assessment there, or what do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think its significance is, I mean, there's been experimental elements and, the last couple releases, I mentioned a horror atmosphere. This is kind of where they really kind of let psychedelic influences enter their sound. And as this being a band that's always been very bold, it's not it's not a matter of experimenting with it or incorporating elements. It's full on just the sort of heavy metal guitar they've been leaning on, combined with maybe some blues influences and some of the especially the soloing and the melodic aspects. You still have classical elements, but probably what stands out the most as far as being different than anything else at this point is the just layers of analog synthesizer that contribute to all kinds of things. That might be orchestration, it could be reggae elements, it could be a waltz, just all sorts of things. There's just, if you open up the booklet, they credit Mirai with whatever different instruments specifically he's played, whether those are organs or Moog synthesizers, harpsichords, all sorts of things. And it's just a really really great album to digest, listen to on different maybe audio sources. Like, it's definitely a different album if you listen to it on headphones and just kind of pick apart the layers, listen to everything that's happening. Even it's not an album that's difficult to approach necessarily, because there's great riffs. I mean, even if you never dive into the album that much, like, there's great heavy metal on there, and just all sorts of different explorations in a psychedelic approach.
I would agree there. This record seems to be a little more melodic, and it's also you also notice they kind of reel back the song lengths a little bit. Though there's also significant. This is their first and only release on Century Media Records, put out July 23rd, 2001.
Yes, they Century Media was not happy with this album. I think a lot of it was, well, I think this album might have been a little bit, they promoted the band. I know they did some touring on this, but I know, not to jump from this album yet, since I do want to talk about it more, it being my favorite of theirs, I think maybe their most significant. I know that they were dropped from the label before they could get a chance to issue a follow-up, just because Century Media wanted a black metal band, more or less, and it was too weird, and they didn't know how to promote it, something like that. Because I think at this point, probably Century Media, I don't know if it was still in existence at this point, but they had their Century Black imprint, which mostly was acquiring black metal bands from other black metal and dark bands from other labels that they put out stuff from Emperor, Sacramentum, even early Opeth, a lot of stuff like that. But I think the idea probably would have been that Sigh could have been a band that fit in with that, but they, are notorious for not really fitting in anywhere. Yeah, I actually hadn't really given it too much thought. Yeah, there's not, with the glaring exception of Slaughter Garden Suite, it is maybe there aren't as many long tracks as certain albums. Scenario 4, I don't think, had a lot of really epic length songs, but the Slaughter Garden Suite is definitely a very sort of deliberate approach to. I don't really want to compare it to progressive metal, because I feel like if you have a song with the word sweet in it, and I talk about progressive metal, you're gonna expect something that's like Rush, but maybe more in the spirit of the original prog rock, which is a piece with multiple movements in it, which that song's very interesting. I would say it makes sense in that it's placed towards the end of the album, because it kind of represents leaning on the two very very different sides. Well, there's more, I would say there's definitely more than two sides to this album, but we could say the heavy metal element and the outside influences.
Right.
That song's definitely has the most I would say left field experimentation to it, but also I it's got some just really great harmonized melodies that would fit in an Iron Maiden song.
I know you're trying to say it's media. Century Media kind of wanted them to be lumped in with the other black metal bands of the day, and I have it in my notes here for a Sunset song, somewhat atypical.
Oh yeah, that's I once again, I think the way that's placed in the album makes sense. You would never want to open the album with something like that. It's got
Right.
almost like a laid back sound to it, and then all of a sudden there's a disco part. But I love that. I love that song. I love playing that song for people because, like I said, it's got kind of a laid back approach to it. But there's still some crunchy guitar in the verses, and there's still raspy vocals all through this album, and with some vocoder and other strange elements on top of it. But that's kind of the backbone of the vocal arrangements. But I love to see people's faces when all of a sudden it just kicks into that kind of
Yeah.
that beat with the horns and everything.
That's something that's something I came to appreciate about with Size, that they will just take that sudden dramatic left turn for whatever reason. But again, it's a you said it's done in a tasteful, with an intentional way, and I think that makes it work, because it's not doing it just for the sake of doing it. It's done with an it's calculated, I guess we can say. And
I think that's probably the biggest takeaway is it's never a band just trying to be weird.
in a progressive sense, I've also noticed they're not really like overtly technical too at the same time. Not like a very all capable musicians, but it's not like like compared to say uh, Atheist or any of the tech death bands that are going today. Composition seems to be a very forefront with this band.
Yeah, absolutely. They've never been a band that's necessarily bogged down by complicated time signatures. I don't think they really necessarily need to. I think that is one of the most interesting parts about them is I think that core is sort of maintained with just straightforward good riffs. I mean, the riffing has gotten much more heavy metal at this point as opposed to black metal, but I still think it carries the same spirit, which is just kind of somewhat sinister heavy metal. At this point, like I said, it might be more melodic. Um, the newer stuff, there's definitely a lot of shreddy guitar, but it's kind of more. It's definitely not necessarily part of the songwriting. It's kind of more of an accent and more of their current guitarist style, which we'll get to him. Speaking of guitar, I do think while I wouldn't consider any of it technical, especially not in an atheist way, that Shinichi's guitar work at this point is just mind blowing.
Hmm.
Considering the way the band's all grown together, this is still the same, core three,
Hmm.
group of guys. But it's not a case of just, Mirai adding a bunch of weird keyboards or anything like that. At this point now, Satoshi's the drummer. Once
Hmm.
again, he's, kind of filling in whatever they need. Mirai's playing bass, keyboards, and vocals. But Shinichi's guitar work, there's like I think my favorite as far as his work goes, probably for anything they've done, is Ecstatic Transformation, which is a very kind of blues rock,
Hmm.
blackened heavy metal song.
Right.
And his soloing is just fantastic. And he was never a really technical player, but I don't think very many guitar players in heavy metal could just slide into those blues solos. And there's songs where maybe that aren't as riff based, where he's taking a more subdued approach and doing things that obviously his field of influences is much wider than heavy metal. And it's kind of remarkable that the band was able to grow that way, and it wasn't like one member was like, nah, I don't want to do this, something, this kind of music or whatever, but that they all were pushing their boundaries.
One thing that really stuck out to me, the sort of the organ work that comes in Corpse Cry, Angel Fall. Again, it's becoming more. Now that I know that Barai basically has the classical training, I can see, okay, well, that's where all this apparently comes from.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely his influences and fascination with other kinds of music is very prominent. Like I said, the what kind of hits you first are those psychedelic elements, but
Right.
there's plenty of blues influence in that. And he could rip out an organ solo. I don't know anyone else who is playing black metal who could do something like that.
So this was a one and done with Century Media Records. How long were they on the label exactly?
I mean, a few years, I guess. Well, I think I was going to say there's a gap between this and their next album, Gallows Gallery, but I think part of the reason there was a gap was because probably exiting Century Media was more complicated. I don't know if they were contractually obligated to deliver an album and just kind of mutually, stepped aside from their contract with the label. But I know this is one of, I think, the few times that there was a significant, gap between releases. But I do believe parting with Century Media is part of the reason why. It just, in a way, I think it's maybe more of a badge of honor at this point. The band's probably back on one of the more known, heavy metal labels, but I Century Media just didn't know what to do with them, and
Hmm.
they weren't a band that would fall in any kind of mold, or I would say really made sense to be on that kind of label at the time. So I don't know. To me, that's a badge of pride to be able to put out something that was just that fundamentally
Yeah.
misunderstood from its inception. But they were a band with good instincts, and
Hmm.
I think it's an enduring recording for sure.
Going from that, this next release was probably, I think, the first time I heard about this band. I want to say, I remember, I think, back in one of my old copies of Metal Maniacs I have lying around somewhere, there's an interview corresponding around the time this album came out. Gallows Gallery put out October 31st, 2005, their first on Candlelight Records. What's your take on this record, Adrian?
I think I probably was becoming familiar with them around the same time then. I can't say I remember exactly when Gallows Gallery came out, but I know it was the new album when I was kind of first seriously, checking the band out. But that was kind of it was always a slow process with them for me, which is I think part of the reason why they've always been so enduring as my favorite band. It wasn't like, oh, I heard, this one song and it hooked me and I loved it so much and it was my
Right.
favorite band. It was not immediate. It was I listened to them for years until finally I was kind of like, oh wow, there's a lot going on here, throughout different albums and within the same, song I might have heard 5 times. There's so much more I didn't even pick up on. But Gallows Gallery specifically kind of reminds me in some ways of Scenario 4. It's probably more highly regarded by sci fans, but in that it's kind of a more, I don't want to use the word reserved necessarily because that sounds like in the scope of Sigh, as adventurous as they are, using the word reserved almost sounds like, an insult. But maybe refined is a better way to put it. Definitely more hook based, definitely more songs. This is where they, I think, really double down on that NWOBHM element you kind of mentioned earlier, and kind of compartmentalize the psychedelic elements. There's definitely, you still get organ solos and saxophone and stuff like that, but it sounds more like a live band, I suppose.
Hmm.
What's interesting though is they never touch this album live because of the vocals, which
Hmm.
is something that really sets it apart. In some ways, I think this is a good album to start with because it's probably their catchiest, I would
Hmm.
think. And the melodic guitar parts, I really can't imagine being a metalhead and it not, getting your attention. But the weird part is that this album is all clean singing,
Hmm.
albeit very layered and off kiltered. But it was something the band hadn't done before and then fully committed to it on this album. And like I said, I think that was part of the reason why they left Century Media, was that Century Media did not want this album. And it was originally released unmastered. And I remember at the time there was, I don't remember, I think it was in interviews they talked about, they said that the album, if there was anything strange on it, once again, they're doing a disclaimer, was because they used experimentation with sonic weapons that had been used by, the military and all that stuff. And
Okay.
there was a whole thing that Mirai had, they said that he had been hospitalized, all this, and all of it was just bullshit because they ran out of money and it wasn't actually really mastered in its first release. So there's a couple of different releases of that where it's been remastered. I think probably I think the remaster was better. The bass stands out more. And as someone who's heard these recordings a million times, I definitely stick with that version more. This was a significant album, in that it introduced the band's new drummer, Junichi Harashima.
Okay.
And he was, I think, plays a pretty big influence. This album's a little more upbeat, almost thrashy, which we see the next album they get very thrashy. But he was always I think, a more natural sounding drummer than Satoshi was. Like I said, Satoshi's always been, such an important
Yeah.
member of Psy in that he's always kind of been, it seems like, the understated quiet sort of contributor, but like I said, he's been there since the beginning. He's played whatever the band has needed. He was their drummer when they needed a drummer, and then when they sort of found someone who could do a lot on the drums, he slid back into playing guitar and bass for this album.
After Gallows Gallery, 2 years later, June 12th, 2007, they put out Hangman's Hymn on. Probably they've jumped from Candlelight. They're now on The End Records, correct?
Yes. I think with Gallows Gallery, there wasn't any kind of, I think, commitment with labels, because I think it was either the original, or I think it depends what territory it was at, but it was also released by Baphomet Records, which was Killjoy from Necrophagia's label, and it was distributed by Redstream, who did all the Necrophagia stuff. Which there was a kinship there. Necrophagia played some live shows with Mirai playing keyboard
Hmm.
back when they had, I mean, a hell of a lineup. Because I know it was, Killjoy. It was I'm blanking on his name, but I know they had one of the members of R Noir, and he played live for Immortal. So this was a band that was based out of the United States, Norway, and Japan somehow.
No. Wow.
But I know that they were, very work together in some different capacities. But I think it was more a favor to them for it to come out, through Baphomet, I want to say, in the States, and then Candlelight in Europe, because Century Media bailed on them.
Hmm.
But yeah, at this point with Hangman's Hymn, they're on The End Records, which seemed to work out for a little bit, which we'll get into how that ended when we get there. I'm kind of curious, because I know you are definitely. I know you know your shit with thrash metal and speed metal. What your impression of Hangman's Hymn is, if you got a chance to listen to it much?
Well, a little bit. No, we're sort of now in the 2000s now. Has there been a sort of a shift in tone in like? I feel like there's a overall impression I kind of got was that okay, it's like there's an overall sort of experimental metal nature to their music, not necessarily pure extreme metal. We'll probably go back and listen to this one a little more now if it's got the more thrashy of their back catalog.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is definitely them really experimenting with, high tempos. They were never a band with blast beats, in their
Okay.
black
Yeah.
metal days. They always had, I would say their faster parts kind of had like a Venom swagger. And, I think as much as we probably mentioned Venom, and as much as the band covers Venom, there's always been a Celtic Frost element in their sound too.
It's probably the time to mention it. Over the course of their career, they've had two releases that are exclusively Venom covers, correct?
Yes, I think the first one was a bootleg the band endorsed, and then the second one actually follows Hangman's Hymn on the End Records, which I think it was kind of weird at the time, because as much as the way vinyl's treated now, I think it was an experiment to see if people would buy vinyl, because they're at this point, their last few albums weren't released on vinyl. And then the Venom tribute they did was exclusively released on vinyl. It came with a CD, but I actually remember, getting it like the different color variants off a bargain section, because I don't think it sold when it came out on vinyl. I don't think anyone cared, which is weird to think about now. But these albums weren't even being pressed on vinyl at all.
Hmm.
But yeah, that was yeah, definitely for them. It's something, like I said, they still close their sets with a cover of black metal usually, and bust out side covers here and there. But yeah, not to sidestep too much, Hangman's Hymn, I think in some ways probably links back to probably some of their earliest influences. A lot of early black metal was extremely influenced by maybe the more underground, darker, uglier, nastier thrash metal stuff. which this album has a definite element of. I would say it seems like it's almost really inspired by a lot of early German thrash. It's got a much cleaner sound than those bands, but it's got that kind of recklessness to it.
Hmm.
But this being Psy, there's a lot more to it than that. It's also very orchestral. In some ways, I like to think of this as kind of the opposite side of the coin from Gallows Gallery, in that it's a more song based kind of straightforward sound in a way, but it's more about merging a couple disparate elements, rather than really layering a ton of different influences. And there's a lot of orchestral flourishes. And overall, I mean, I say it's a song based album, and I think it is. But what's interesting about this is it's arranged in a way that there are a lot of motifs on this.
Okay.
It's definitely, recommend listening to this album a few times to pick up on all that. It culminates on the last track, which I absolutely blows my mind, where there's maybe like a 30-second part of the song where they basically recall all the motifs of the album, and kind of, in some instances, are playing more than one of them at a time.
Wow.
So you might hear a riff and then, okay, I'm hearing that on organ twice as slow. And then it's just like kind of incorporating another song very briefly, which, is something that I think could probably be accredited to that, classical training
Okay.
and influence. But it's not overdone. It's not done gimmicky, and it's something I don't think you'd even notice maybe the first time you listen to it. But eventually you kind of start to figure out, these main melodies are kind of carried throughout the album, but are introduced in different ways throughout. Once again, you could focus on that, or you could just be paying attention to the fact that this is a very thrashy, just energetic album.
After Hangman's Hymn, our next release, also on the End Records, released January 19th, 2010, we have Scenes from Hell. And I think this is the first record officially that has Dr. Mankivo,
Mechanical, I think it is. Yeah.
Mechanical, yes, officially joining the lineup.
Yeah, she was. I know that the Venom tribute that they had recorded, we were just talking about a moment ago, was kind of used to introduce her in a way. She only did vocals on that because,
Hmm.
I mean, she was, also the band's saxophonist. But that's something I find interesting, is that as experimental as they are, it's like when they play Venom covers, like they didn't add saxophone or anything like that. I think they understand Venom, why it works, and
Hmm.
they're not going to kind of shove a round peg through a square hole. But I think this is, yeah, it's appropriate to say this is the true introduction to her, where she's splitting vocals with Mirai, which I think really was a smart move, because especially when they play a lot of the Hangman's Hymn material live, I think because it's more straightforward and energetic. But live, there's so much rapid fire vocals, where that it would be almost impossible for one person to do them. They're going back and forth, and on this album there's a lot of that. She has a very, very low, it almost sounds like Autopsy influenced kind of vocal style, where it's just kind of nasty. But then she also contributes saxophone in a lot of these songs.
Why the saxophone of all instruments?
Well, I know that I've heard Mirai reference it, and once again, for him, it's not a matter of doing something weird. It's saxophone has plenty of history in rock music. Heavy metal, maybe not so much. Although I think at this point, you could probably find a decent handful of bands that have experimented
Hmm.
one way or another with saxophone. I think it was probably, Mechanical had sort of entered the fold of the band, and she was primarily a death metal vocalist, but also could play saxophone. And at this point, Sigh's had multiple releases that have featured either saxophone or synthesizers imitating saxophone. So I mean, it that didn't seem like a strange element for me. It was kind of more just exciting, like, oh, they actually have a saxophone player. Gallows Gallery, they had a guest who played on, I want to say, like 3 songs. But here it's a little bit more of a featured instrument. I mean, it's not something that's constantly going, but it's something that's used as a solo instrument in some parts and used in accompaniment with orchestral instruments and others. Which this album is significant in that there's not as much keyboard and it's mostly recordings of actual instruments in a really strange way. I know that back when this album was being recorded, they kind of put out a somewhat open call on their message board to people who played classical instruments to record things on their own in a setting where the band could mix them. They did something similar with Hangman's Hymn with the choir vocals. That's mostly just people who were able to record and the band layered remotely, which I mean that's pretty significant for something. This is 12 years ago, Scenes from Hell, and even further back for Hangman's Hymn, that they were doing something like that. I would say that this album, the production is definitely kind of a barrier. It seemed like tonally, I've come to appreciate it. It definitely has. I mean, like a sort of scorched out apocalyptic sound to it. I think, like I said, that puts it maybe a barrier to entry, in that it's not as easy to maybe decipher, all the different individual layers. But the vinyl version sounds better. This actually did get a vinyl release when it came out, and there's a little bit of the return of some of the imaginary soundscape type layering, just a
Hmm.
little bit on some of these. For the most part, though, this is kind of the infidel art to Hangman's Hymns, Scorn Defeat, where it's kind of just more of everything. There's orchestral elements, but they're actually, played by orchestral instruments. There's a little more variation in tempo, but for the most part, this is, an album that's played, very fast and still has that kind of thrash backbone from the last release.
A very graphic artwork for this record as well. Do anything about that?
Oh yeah, it's Elleran Cantor, which this was, if
Okay.
I'm saying that right. I think my first exposure to his work, he is probably my, I'd say absolutely is my favorite artist as far as heavy metal album covers go, past, present, whatever. I mean, his the amount of detail in
Yeah.
that, and just the style, and it almost looks like a Renaissance painting. And the way he incorporated the logo is really cool, and that they didn't just slap a graphic on there or something. But no, I have a huge print of that hanging on my wall. I absolutely love this
Yeah.
album cover.
I recognize the style now that I look at it.
Yeah, he's done. I mean, I'm not sure what he did before that, but since then he's all over the place, which he should be. I mean, he's definitely a genius as far as artists go.
Now, after their next record, In Sonophobia, is that how it's
Yep.
pronounced? Released March 12th, 2012, and they are now back on Candlelight Records. What happened there?
That is true. I actually didn't grasp totally the significance of that. Yeah, like I said, I think before Candlelight, it was kind of like done as maybe a favor. I think Candlelight was originally Samuth from Emperor, his label, if I'm correct. I'm not sure if he, runs it or anything like that still, but I know I'm sure there's history there. I know Faust wrote some lyrics for Sigh, and I mean they're both originals as far as black metal goes. So it makes sense for them to be on a label like that. Insomnophobia is every once in a while, if I between that and Imaginary Sonicescape, that this is definitely to me the follow up to that album, and lives up to it. They are embracing the psychedelic elements again. They still have that very thrashy sound on certain songs that they employed on the last couple albums. We have Dr. McCannibal's vocals and saxophone, and then you have a lot more varied and interesting drumming from Junichi. So I mean, this is kind of to me the perfect follow up to Imaginary Sonicescape. It's structured. Most albums are structured in kind of an A B format, just as a holdover from analog releases where you had to have a side A, a side B. I still think in a lot of ways that's the ideal way to record music and put it together. But this album is more a three-part kind of piece. The idea being that the middle section is sort of where the most experimental, nightmarish kind of material goes. And then you have on either end what they call relatively normal tracks. Any other bands, they would be pretty wildly out there, but those middle tracks have some of that psychedelic atmosphere, but with the Hail Horror Hail approach of not limiting a song to its linear structure, and doing some sound editing, and there's some noise and ambient experimentation. But the idea is, this is the part where someone's asleep, and what they call lucid nightmare is the sort of the intro to the middle. But I think that this is a fantastic place to start, because it kind of has a couple songs that are a little more for Sigh straightforward, but it also has some of their most nightmarish material, and they really commit to that atmosphere, and then kind of bring it out of that into the last couple tracks, which are a little more thrashy, a little more melodic, that sort of thing.
I'm noticing a bit of a return to like the longer song lengths as well. For the previous three records, it's sort of hovering around the 3 to 4 minute mark. This one, they seem to be going well over the 5 minute mark here.
Yeah, the experimental tracks especially, and then the album closer is very structured around classical music. There's sort of an extended movement at the end that's guitar, harpsichord, and drums just conforming to a specific classical style, which I'm not smart enough to recall, but it's a classical form that has specific rules and stuff like that. But the beginning of the song has like a bossa nova guitar solo, so I mean it's definitely Psy doing what they do, which is kind of whatever they want. But yeah, no, this is one of my favorite albums, and another, if we're talking about cover art, which we haven't much at this point, but this is Elleran Cantor, I would say, outdoing himself from Scenes from Hell.
That's very detailed. It's sort of pretty and articulate in a way, but a little grotesque at the same time. Very juxtaposition. Keep coming back to that word here.
Yeah, there was something they did with this album and their more recent album that he also did the cover for, which is that it's kind of like the longer you look at it, the weirder it
Yeah,
gets. Once
yeah,
you
that's
kind of
fair.
see, yeah, it looks like once you kind of start seeing what's kind of what your brain might think is wrong with the photo, and then eventually you're like, oh wait a second, this has a cart full of dead babies on the front. But that's not even
Mhm.
the first thing you notice. There's just so much else going on. The idea was, this is sort of a psychedelic nightmare, and the album paints that picture, and then Elleran Cantor manifested that into visual art as well.
Their next release would be Graveward, released April 15th, 2015 on Candlelight Records. And I believe, does this record have their current lineup now as a band?
Yes, and like I said, that with they're such a consistent band lineup wise. I mean, I think at this point we've only had one person leave, and that was the guy who played drums on their first demo only. So at this point, Yuo Oshima is the new guitarist. I was excited about that. I mean, I definitely was crushed with Shinichi leaving, because he just has such personality in his playing, and who's going to take his spot? Who would make sense for that? Like, you need someone who can play that material, but also someone who has their fingers in that many different elements that Psy covers and can catch up. Yuoshima was the sole member of a very out there kind of experimental black metal band called Cadenza, and I know that when he was added as part of the band, I remember thinking, well, yeah, this guy makes sense. He's done experimental music that's really all over the place, and it's interesting because I don't think didn't necessarily try to replace Shinichi. He definitely does his own thing. He's very much a if Shinichi was more of a blues soloist, Yu is definitely a sort of high octane shredder. And this album, I think Grave Word, to be really honest, I think suffers from that a little bit. I think there was a little bit of adjustment being done.
Okay.
First and foremost, it's a fantastic album. I think it celebrated an anniversary recently, and Sigh, they posted something, and Mirai was always very candid about his work, and he called it their worst album.
Hmm.
And I know I would agree technically, but I wouldn't use the word worst because I wouldn't have an issue showing this album to someone who's new to the band. And it's got a little bit of a muddy sound similar to Scenes from Hell. I think they hadn't quite totally incorporated Yu's style. I think the album was composed with Shinichi in mind originally, but it's still a fantastic album. It's maybe not as committed to the sort of dream atmosphere of Insomnophobia, but it's got sort of a dirge feel to it in atmosphere, not in tempo necessarily. Definitely, Yu makes his presence known. There are still, saxophone elements present and a cannibal contributing. But yeah, it was. I think Insomnophobia would have been tough to follow up, even if they hadn't, lost. For the really, this is the only time they've ever had to really truly replace someone, and I think there's a little bit of those growing pains felt.
It's not bad. It's just not as good as the other ones.
Yeah, there's always there if something's got to be at the bottom, I suppose. Yeah, I regardless, there's a lot of really fantastic moments on this album. Mechanical's vocals, I mentioned that, but most of her vocals are really interesting in that it's a lot of vocoder stuff and a lot of really more experimental things that she does on this rather than just the sort of gruff death metal stuff we've heard from her for a couple albums here.
We finally come to the most recent Psy record, Heir to Despair, put out November 16th, 2018 on Candlelight Records as well. I've got a chance to maybe just listen to a little bit of this one. I was struck, I think, as another case of like how melodic Psy has the capacity of being when given meant to, and also, like I said, throughout for all I've listened to is constant just for me subversion of expectations of what to expect with Psy. They didn't start as like a typical extreme metal band, and they didn't really, in my opinion, progress as a what I would typically think when you think of extreme. I was expecting something like way more left field, and it was left field, but it wasn't like something that I would couldn't wrap my head around or couldn't sit down and enjoy. I sort of like their approach to being unconventional when it comes to their music.
Yeah, it's definitely comes across as natural in whatever way they've presented it.
Well, actually, it seems like in this record too, like we sort of got back to like longer song lengths and title tracks over 10 minutes long here, and now I guess you is now like fully ingrained in the band at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I would say this album's a lot more balanced than Grave Word as far as composition goes. I think I'm just assuming that probably Grave Word was the lineup change took place definitely unexpectedly, somewhere in the process of writing those songs. But Air to Despair seems a little more focused. It seems like every album there's at least a couple obvious new elements the band might try as a and then of course there's plenty of depth to find over repeated listens. But here we have it's interesting because it's definitely not as thrashy overall as Hangman's Hymn or Scenes from Hell, but when they do enter those parts there's some just ridiculously fast stuff. And one thing that sort of lends itself to that, there's a really really high percentage of the vocals on this are in Japanese, which they said was kind of made more sense with those higher tempos, and that the rhythm of the language was much different than English, and is very purposely used. Most songs have a little bit of English and Japanese. It is kind of interesting to just hear how absolutely ridiculously fast some of the vocals are, even though it's not a necessarily an extremely fast album. That's just one of the things they do. We mentioned as an example a while ago about Mirai picking up flute for this album. A lot of the most melodic elements are done on flute, but I mean there's also solos performed on flute. There's some maybe more southeastern influences on this album. And I would love to see the translations, but I think thematically this album is supposed to deal with ideas of nostalgia. And Amir, I talked about influences from kind of maybe, well, then contemporary songs from his youth that were Japanese, and stuff he said, as a kid listening to metal he hated, but now there's a kind of nostalgia for it.
Hmm.
And also an element of exploration of mental illness. I'll have to look up the translations for these, because like I said, most of the album's in Japanese. And then the Heresy trilogy, which is once again the album's kind of structured. That's not quite in the middle, but it's kind of positioned a little bit. It's positioned up to the first four tracks. Is maybe somewhat of a follow up in spirit to Slaughter Garden Suite, in just how out there it is. It's I know before the album came out, he was Mirai was claiming that people would hate it, and of course, people who understood his approach and are fans definitely didn't. But I was definitely, I think this was a step up from Grave Word, a much better production. They sounded like a band again. I don't think Grave Word really sounded as much like a band. This one, all the elements kind of make sense. There's not nearly as much of a presence from Mechanibal on this album, but I would imagine if they are playing any of this material live, it would be almost impossible to do some of those vocal parts without her. I don't believe that, even that this was the most recent album when I saw them in Atlanta. I don't believe they played anything from this. I don't know if that was, like I said, they've always been unconventional in their set list. I'm not sure if it was the idea that the Atlanta show was more of a kind of a festival setting, and that they're not necessarily playing to promote their new album. They're playing to maybe a more old school crowd, or they're playing to people who have never seen them and never had the chance to see them, so they're going to do more of a quote unquote classic set. But regardless, this is their most recent album. I know there's a follow-up in the works, and I definitely hope that the next album is on this level, because I think all the whatever elements they brought together for this, new and old, really they pulled off.
Can we give a classic period to this band, really? Because I have to say, I don't think there's really a record they're like, oh, that's a terrible record right there. There never really seems to be. They're just, since they don't really have a very like defined sound, I guess, in a way. There's just
Mhm.
various periods, maybe you could say. But
Yeah,
is there really a classic time for this band?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't say at all. I mean, if you go album to album, you can find different things that link them. But I mean, you could maybe, like I said, draw a line before Hail Horror Hail and call that early stuff. Maybe they're more. I don't even want to use the word traditional, because that word doesn't apply to them. But that's maybe more their black metal period. I mean, you probably have some people who are purists who only maybe like the first few releases, but I would think if that was your mindset, you probably wouldn't even make it past Scorn Defeat. Yeah, I think generally most people who are Sigh fans accept all of it, in some way or another. There's no glaring, career decisions the band's made where you say, oh, they lost it, or they used to be good, or this period's better than that. It's interesting in that they're in sonically maybe the least consistent band, but quality wise one of the most consistent.
We haven't mentioned, Adrian, is that you probably own at least two copies of everything we've talked about here, correct?
Oh, two is way too low. So recently I did I have an Instagram account, Moore's Omnibus, just for my collection, where the idea was to show off a different release every day, which is all the albums, and some of the other EPs and smaller releases we didn't cover as much, but they have a couple splits here and there and other kind of miscellaneous releases. I have, well, I can pull this up because I do have my Discogs page with my collection catalog in front of it, but I know Scorn Defeat is definitely kind of insane, because I've got 13 copies of that. I try to collect whatever I can, as long as it's not too redundant. I'm not the type to just buy, if something comes out on vinyl, I do not really care what color it is. The exception was that Tribute to Venom EP, just because I found all different colors, really cheap. But yeah, and if I stumble across something, I've made a point to kind of acquire all the old releases in their original format, the original demo tapes, any of the 7 inches on, the vinyl they've put out. Probably one of the coolest things I have is the original, the other Tribute to Venom release they did, which was the cassette bootleg that they kind of adopted as official. But I have a copy of that used to be Jim Conya's from Nunslaughter. After he passed, one of my friends texted me. I think at this point I have this reputation. It's not the first time I've got a text like this where someone's come across something Sigh that looks rare, and someone is like, "Hey, do you have this?" And usually it's yes, but that was a case of holy shit, no, I need that. But I mean, I if I like to kind of, I mean, it's a brag that I love to throw out because I don't think I really have competition. Is that I have the biggest Psy collection. I really, back in the day of their message board, I knew another guy who maybe had as much stuff as me. And if someone does, I would love to find out because I love to see what they have. But I know at one point in correspondence with Mirai, he had mentioned that I have way more Psy stuff than he does at this point. And he's even asked me questions about certain things that have come out because some of it's kind of borderline official, like maybe a label puts out something and the band has no clue about it. At this point, I feel like I've got the closest thing to a museum to this band that would ever exist.
How many times have you had a chance to see Psy live?
Just twice. Which, well, I can't imagine too many people in America have seen them twice even. But I saw them on the 2019 Mass Destruction Fest where they headlined, and then once on their US tour when they were on the End Records. And I think I'd mentioned, that kind of went down in flames. The tour was apparently very successful, but at that point, the End Records was fizzling out. I guess what had happened was they made a decent amount of money on that tour and then used all that money to get contracts with Lordy and Mindless Self Indulgence, and then the label went under. And from what I hear, they still never paid Psy for that tour. So
Mm.
maybe that contributes to them not playing live as much. But no, I've been lucky enough to see them live twice for a band from Japan that barely plays live. I'm happy about that.
Well, how would you describe Psy in a live setting?
It's definitely interesting because they take a different approach to their material. A lot of bands you think, oh, they replicate what's on the album so well, and that's a matter of that's a compliment for some bands. Psy, I think they know enough not to necessarily approach that because I think that would either require a dozen musicians or a ton of backing tracks, and I think that's just not really in the spirit of a heavy metal show. So like I said, they're more likely to play a lot of older material live or the stuff from Hangman's Hymn. Both of these are kind of they're more guitar based albums that don't maybe necessarily have a ton of layers. I'd still love to see them play something from Gallows Gallery live, but I know they maintain that the layering and the vocals is what prevents that. Mirai has experimented with some different clean singing, more recently on the more recent album. So I don't know. It doesn't seem too necessarily like it'd be impossible. Like I said, I think they're smart about the stuff they do. They're more likely to play tracks from Scorn Defeat and Ghastly Funeral Theater than maybe in Imaginary Sonicscape. But I think they know people really respond to that album, so they'll usually do one of the more straightforward songs where and Mirai will play whatever lead parts on keyboard. But yeah, no, they're the band. They had some theatrics, some energy. Dr. McCannibal's part of kind of responsible for a lot of theatrics too. But when I saw them in Atlanta, there was fire, there was blood, there was everything you'd want from a metal show.
I guess final thoughts, man. What generally is for you has been the long-term appeal of Psy?
Like I said, it wasn't ever, there's some bands that are some of my favorite bands that were very immediate. I could tell you, oh, this is the first time I heard this, and it just immediately grabbed my attention. Whereas Psy was kind of something I was curious about. I'd see the album covers and I knew a little bit of their history, and it just seemed like something really interesting that I was kind of, more researching than just stumbling across, organically maybe. But it just, some bands maybe you might be, they might be immediately attractive to you, and then, maybe you find their classic period and you find like, oh, they lost it at this point or whatever. With Sigh, it's just always been, I've just always become more enamored the deeper I look. When I would go album to album, every album was different in that it had different approaches and influences, but consistent in that quality and that detail, and that adventurousness. And it just, it's, I've never heard a bad song from them. And just the deeper I look, I'll find, new things I've never heard or never noticed. And those songs just, grow more important as the years goes by. And on top of that, it's never been nostalgia for me, because I would say some of their most recent material is some of their best as well.
For me, I've really never had a chance really to dive into their music, listen to them until about a few weeks ago. Pretty much given their whole discography a good once over. I can't remember everything, but initial impression for me is that I was just again, expectations very much subverted. They have the extreme metal elements in there. They are very much an extreme metal band, but at the same time, there's also a whole litany of just other things in there that I think you can't help but just sit there and be impressed by. You, these are artists, very much in every sense of the word. I would say, and you may like something more than something else in their catalog, but I would never say that basically, oh, there's just a, oh, that's a terrible record, you can't listen to that one, or point is, so pretty much the whole, they're a very strong back catalog, and definitely I'm going to be continuing to visit more and more in the future.
Yeah, definitely. They're a band that repeated listens pay off. And I feel like once you kind of get a feel for the different albums, you might appreciate different elements, that are scattered sporadically throughout their career, and all of those influences they have.
Adrian, I really appreciate you taking this trip with me and enlightening us all, pretty much being the de facto Psy scholar here.
Oh yeah, I will see if I can get a business card that says that.
Well, folks, thank you for joining us here on Screen Buddy Podcast. I'm Woody.
And I'm Adrian.
Have a good night, folks.